I don't really want to speculate on Portland. I do think we should start with the Chris Paul, Porzingis, all of this stuff. So, some initial thoughts with Porzingis. I like the move for Boston. Gives them a little more shooting in the front court. Porzingis had his best season of his career last year, very quietly, because not a lot of people pay attention to Washington. In particular, his defensive numbers, whether that was playing drop coverage or protecting the rim or as the primary defender, all really, really good last year. So he had his best defensive season of his career. And then you mix that in with the scoring and the production. They're getting a really good player who still is in his prime. He, probably will never be a 75 plus game participant in an NBA season, but he held up last year, and I like the move. Two-man game, him and Jason Tatum, two-man game, him and Jaylen Brown. It gives them a little bit more oomph, I think, to the offense, and I don't think they lost a ton defensively, given how good Derek White was last year. I also love the deal for Memphis. I think that's a strong move for them. Essentially, they gave up 2 picks for Marcus Smart, which doesn't feel way off. Memphis is another team that similar to, not maybe to the degree of OKC and Sam Presti, but they have draft capital. There was a need there, given that Dylan Brooks is likely not going to come back, and given that John Morant's going to be suspended for the first 25 games. So now all of a sudden, Memphis, who had a top defense last year, has the last 2 defensive players of the year on that roster. So I really like the move for Memphis.
Boston question for a second. So Porzingis numbers last year is 23.2 points, 8.4 rebounds, 1.3 blocks, 49.8% from the field, 38.5% from 3, 18th best estimated plus minus in the league. Defensively, you just mentioned he had his best season. We talked a lot about the way Boston has this on both sides of the ball, but they have basically like this positionless roster, which makes them so effective, where they all can kind of switch 1 through 5. He's a lot of good things defensively, but he's, what is he, 7'2"? He's just a big dude. It's going to be harder for him to do that. So do you think this changes some of their thought process schematically a little bit, whether or not Williams is playing with him in terms of like their ability to switch like that?
Well, if you go back to the playoffs, they didn't switch a ton with Robert Williams or Al Horford. So they played a lot of drop coverage. I thought at times in the regular season, they switched too much with Al Horford. And look, Al Horford is a really good defender. He had some very, very good games against Joel Embiid in that second round. But let's just be honest. Al Horford is on the other side of 35. Like he's not getting any younger. And particularly at times in that Philly series, even against Miami, he was in a heavy drop. So I don't think schematically it changes really anything, because they're also willing to play that way. I think it gives him a little more versatility, being able to play him at the 5. And look, at this point in his career, he's a better player than Al Horford. And so you can go small, play him at the 5. You could probably play him at times with Robert Williams and go big. I don't know necessarily that's like something you're going to do for 30 minutes a game, but it just gives them more. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I know that, on the second spectrum stuff, like when you look at opponent field goal percentage with him, him in drop coverage, like all the numbers are really good, upper 75th percentile in drop coverage. I think he was like even higher than that in opponent field goal percentage. He had a really good defensive season. And so I think they don't lose a lot there, but they gain a lot offensively. And that's why I think this deal is a really good deal for Boston. Plus, they get the 2 first-round picks. They obviously move back in the draft off the 25th pick this year. But all in all, you basically trade Marcus Smart for Porzingis and two first-round picks. That seems like a really good deal for Boston. By the way, speaking of Washington, so everyone has sort of pointed this out, and I think I want to provide a little bit of context on the Washington trades, because you see the comments on Twitter, you see the memes, whatever. Obviously, Rudy Gobert gets a ton of first round picks. I know there was we keep bringing this guy up, but there was a guy last year at the deadline that Memphis offered for 5 first-round picks for, and you look at Washington and they trade Bradley Beal, they trade Kristaps Porzingis, and then they trade Chris Paul, they reroute Chris Paul. So they got 3 separate transactions, and all they get out of that is a protected 2030 first-round pick. But the context of each trade, I think, matters, because with Bradley Beal, he had a no-trade clause, and his representatives and Bradley could basically determine where he wanted to go. And it was very clear, even leading up to that, since Marshall Winger took over, it was very clear. It seemed like Washington was going to go the full rebuild mode, right? And they were going to get off the bad contracts, and they were going to try to, build through the draft, whatever. Phoenix, of course, gave up all their picks for Kevin Durant, so they couldn't trade him there. So, you didn't have a lot of optionality there to get back first-round value. With Porzingis, that was very much coming down to the deadline. He could have opted out. For that trade to happen, he had to opt in. So again, he's holding the leverage in that situation. And then with Chris Paul, look, he's not at the stage of his career making $30 million a year for 1 year, where I don't think it warrants giving up a straight first-round pick. And so they ended up getting a 2030 protected pick in that deal. So each pick is different. But yeah, if you're a Wizards fan, I get the frustration of not getting back a first-round haul of picks.
Yeah. I was going to say, the other thing with the Memphis part of it, do you think they're going to miss, and you're going to laugh at this because I talk about it all the time, but do you think they're going to miss Tyus a little bit?
Oh, of course. Of course. I mean that's why I think the deal for Washington, getting him, getting Jordan Poole, you're going to have a serviceable and competent backcourt. Like they're going to win some games, and they're going to be entertaining at times. Tyus Jones plays great basketball, and so yeah, that's gonna hurt Memphis to some degree. But Marcus Smart's ability to play on the ball, and I know I've never said they should get rid of Marcus Smart. I've never said Marcus Smart is a point guard, but I know I've said. I've always looked at Boston and been like, if they had a point guard or a guard that put a little more pressure on the rim and it made things a little easier for Jason and Jalen, that would be great. And Marcus Smart doesn't necessarily do that, but he was awesome for them. And he's a point guard, and he's been a facilitator, and he's had a high assist number. Like, it's not like he's not a point guard. So the Tyus thing, yes, it hurts. I think culturally it hurts a little bit, but then you make up for it with Marcus Smart.
The Boston fans are going through it because I feel like they all recognize what you just said, what we both just said about Porzingis and the upside there. But there's Marcus. It's like not really a basketball thing. It's like this is just a guy that's like represented what that franchise has been since he's gotten there. When we did a live show with him, we could see it. And so I feel like they're juggling those emotions on the Chris trade. I mean, I want to get your sort of thoughts on it, but I guess on a macro level with these two teams, with Golden State and Boston, these are two teams coming off a finals appearance a year ago. It feels like they're both doing a version of like a mini reset. Like they're not blowing anything up in a big way, but they're just trying to infuse some version of change into. I think both of them have sort of had disappointing runs last year in different ways. What do you think Chris brings initially? And then I guess when you first saw the trade, I think we talked about this last week. We sort of both thought Chris was going to end up in LA. And we mentioned Golden State offhand, but it wasn't a thing that I think that was really expected. Where do you see that? You see him come off the bench. Like, what do you think in terms of just like an on-court fit at first?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I wouldn't call either team. I wouldn't call the strategy a mini reset. I would call it just a straight reload, right? With respect to Boston, I've said post Eastern Conference Finals, I said that group togetherness, not the players themselves. I had to clarify that a million times, but the group felt like maybe they had reached their ceiling. Now, within that group is Tatum and Brown. I don't think they should have broken them up. It's so hard to replace wings at that level. And so then you have to sort of look at, all right, who else on the roster has value if we're going to trade? And the obvious answer there to me was Marcus Smart. If that you're going to move in a different direction off that group, Marcus was the guy that was going to trade, and they get a guy who's made an all-star team and again had a fabulous season. So to me, it was more like a reload. With Golden State, it goes back to, I want to be very careful with my words here because it was relayed to me that when I said on the draft night that they whiffed on a few of their lottery picks, that wasn't taken well within the Golden State organization. So maybe they didn't whiff. They missed an opportunity to not only just build for the future, but to have players that could provide contribution with the core group, the older group, right? And I'm not out on Moody and I'm not out on Kuminga. In fact, I'm still very high on Kuminga. But what happened last year, they lose Otto Porter Jr., they initially lose Gary Payton II. They didn't have the connecting pieces. And if you look, it was Sean Livingston, it was Zaza, it was Bogut, it was Andre Iguodala, of course, it was Otto Porter Jr., it was Gary Payton. Like, they've always had these connecting pieces. And to me, that's where I think Chris can help. He's a connecting piece. Second most assists on three-pointers in the NBA since play-by-play was tracked in 1996, 1997. And now he's joining arguably the two best shooters ever. I think the two best shooters ever. So the off-ball stuff, that's not going to be on Chris in terms of movement and cutting and all that. But as a facilitator and a connector, he can really help there. My initial reaction, though, it was a little puzzling. And I maybe said this when you brought up Golden State last week as a potential Chris Paul destination, but it was initially a little puzzling because of the contrast in styles, right? Steph has described Golden State as chaotic, and I think that's a pretty good description. There's a lot of random, and I think that's sometimes where young players, if you're not familiar playing like that, that's where it's hard to sort of fit in. Chris is smart enough. He's one of the smartest basketball players ever. He's going to figure out a way to contribute and help them win games. But the contrast in play style is very apparent, right? He's a methodical player. He's calculated all of that stuff. The numbers back this up. There's some great stuff on this. So speed on offense. Warriors this past year, they had the 6th fastest average speed on offense. Paul had the slowest average speed on offense amongst players with 1,000 minutes played. Average touch length. Warriors always talk about the 0.5 stuff. It's sort of like how Pop played late in that Spurs era when they were able to beat the Heat in the finals. It's the 0.5 mentality. Warriors had the shortest average touch length on offense at 2.7 seconds. Chris Paul had the 7th longest average touch length at 5.6 seconds. The other part is since Steve Kerr took over, the Golden State Warriors have ran the fewest ball screens in the NBA. Last year, Chris had the 4th most on-ball screens in the NBA. Warriors had the 3rd fewest. So in that regard, maybe there's more pick and roll. My point to that, which I made on the draft, and I'll repeat it here, I feel like Chris has always played with two types of players, where he's had a lot of success in pick and roll, has generally been with two types of players, right? It has been with rim runners like DeAndre Jordan, like Tyson Chandler, or really skilled bigs like David West, like Blake Griffin, DeAndre Ayton. And, the one outlier there is probably, again, in Houston, Clint Capella, OKC, I guess Steven Adams is a rim runner, but Chris had a lot of success. That's why I'm not super negative on him running pick and rolls with Kevon Looney or him running pick and rolls with Draymond. But you wish there was another front court guy on the roster that he could run 2-man game with outside of those two. That would be my one observation on maybe my one question mark is like, how much success are they going to have in pick and roll with those two guys?
The Warriors were minus 17.7 with no Steph last year. We talked about it from the beginning of the season on. It was a huge reason why they struggled against the Lakers as well. It was just, when he would come out of the game. Do you think it is, in terms of the contrasting styles, it's really interesting. Do you think that there's a world where it could work, where basically you get the best of both worlds, where you basically keep the Warriors starting five humming the way that it has been, since Steph has been there. And then you basically, if Chris is coming off the bench, you basically almost run. It's like you have two separate units who are almost running two different types of offenses in the same game and forcing the defense to adjust based off of personnel in that way.
Well, in theory, the idea is sound. But we still don't know who else is on the Warriors. And from my understanding, our friend Bobby Marks at ESPN has his offseason guides for every team. Even without bringing back Draymond, because this team is in the luxury tax and they don't have JaMychal Green's bird rights or Dante DiVincenzo's bird rights, they may have some problems just bringing those two guys back, let alone, Draymond, of course. And by the way, going back to the deal, this has been a team that has been in the repeater tax, has shown that they're willing to spend, they're willing to pay all the luxury tax money. But I do think getting off Jordan Poole at $30 million a year over the next 3 years, and now you bring in Chris at 1 year, it does relieve a little bit of that. So from that regard, from just a cap standpoint, it makes sense. And look, I don't know, the idea of Chris coming off the bench. Yeah, that seems like the right play to me, but that's not to say I could envision them in different series in the playoffs, starting him at the point and going a little smaller. The one thing I'll say to that is I like Steph Curry with the ball in his hands. I mean, as good as he is off the ball, I love him on the ball. And, he showed in that Lakers series at pick and roll at a high volume just how special he is in pick and roll. And I want to clarify one thing, because I meant to say this when I was talking about Chris and pick and roll running with Kevon Looney and Draymond. It's two different things. Chris Paul in pick and roll and Steph Curry in pick and roll. Steph Curry, because of his range and his ability to shoot heavily contested pull-up threes, it creates a lot of problems for a defense when you bring the big up and you have Draymond Green rolling or Kevon Looney rolling and it's 4-on-3 on the backside. You're not going to get that with Chris. With Chris, you're going to get him snaking pick and rolls, trying to get back to his right hand for his pull-up elbow jumper. How much separation is he really creating at this point in his career? It's still there. He's still an effective player. I'm not saying that. But in terms of him getting downhill, creating lob opportunities a la Tyson Chandler, a la DeAndre Jordan, there's just not that guy on the roster.